The QC Pod is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more, visit queenspodcastlab.org. I'm here with Dr. Harold Schechter, a true crime writer, really the godfather of the modern true crime literary genre. He's a specialist in serial killers and a professor emeritus at Queen's College. Dr. Schechter, thank you for joining me.
Well, my pleasure.
So you're a true crime writer, and I'm on the other end of that spectrum as a true crime consumer, you could say. What is it that draws people like you and I to such dark content like true crime?
First of all, it's very important to recognize that there has always been a mass audience for true crime narratives. People sometimes think it's a very recent phenomenon, but in fact, some of the earliest true crime books were printed pretty much after the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. And some of the earliest pieces of writing that were printed in our own country after the English Puritans came over were true crime pamphlets and true crime broadsides. So there's always been this appetite for that kind of lurid, sensationalistic material. A quote that I often use from the Greek philosopher Plato is, "The virtuous man dreams what the wicked man does." So the point of that quote is that everybody, all of us moral, law-abiding citizens, have a dark side to our personalities. Following the law and obeying a strict moral code, in a way takes a toll on us because there is a part of ourselves that is still rooted in the archaic savagery of our primate ancestors. And, that part has to be suppressed, but it needs some kind of outlet. And true crime is one of the ways it gets that outlet. Freud deals with that in his classic book, Civilization and Its Discontents. These deep, primitive, instinctual urges we create civilization to protect us from nature, but it comes as a cost, to certain very primal, instinctual urges, which require an outlet. And, civilization, our culture has provided socially acceptable outlets for that. True crime is one. If you look at the realm of popular culture, it's basically mostly sex and violence. And the reason for that is, again, that part of ourselves, what the psychologist Jung called the shadow side, needs some way to ventilate itself, or satisfy itself. So that's my feeling on that subject.
So it's kind of like the same thing as an obsession with like scary movies.
Yeah. Stephen King has a metaphor. Stephen King wrote a very, very good book about horror. And he uses a metaphor of, somewhere in the sub-basement of our minds, there's a trap door. And if you open it up, there are all these savage alligators swimming around. And every now and then you got to throw them a piece of meat. So, stuff like true crime is, that meat.
Speaking of horror, I've noticed that, or at least what I gathered from a lot of the serial killers that you've written about, especially your earlier books, Ed Gein and Albert Fish, they're almost like these real personification of traditional horror characters like werewolves and vampires.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Very astute observation. In fact, when I first began writing in my earliest true crime books, the ones about Fish and Ed Gein, and H.H. Holmes, I thought immodestly that I was inventing a new literary genre because I thought of them as true horror more than true crime for precisely the reason that you gave. I was very interested in the ways that certain very extreme murderers get transformed into these figures of, or they get assimilated to these pre-existing archetypal stories about monsters and so on. And it's one of the reasons why certain serial killers are immediately described in the paper in supernatural terms, because they do seem like these mythological monsters made flesh and blood. And again, it's one of the things that drew me to become, to the whole genre. I'm old now. I'm a baby boomer. When I grew up in the 1950s, American culture was steeped in horror entertainment. I grew up watching all the old horror movies on these creature feature shows, spending or misspending my Saturdays going to these children's matinees of, grade Z horror movies. They had all these horror comics. So I was always very interested in horror and monsters. and why. And then as I grew older, began to think about these things in a different way, why people crave stories of monsters and horror. And so I think some of the true crime stuff, like the earliest books I read, do deal with figures whose crimes are so completely horrific that they came to seem in the popular imagination like these fairy tale ogres come to life.
Right. And you touched on the concept of this immortalization of certain crimes or killers in pop culture. And I always thought it was fascinating that certain crimes become mythologized and they become such key narratives in our history, while other crimes, which may be equally, if not more heinous, get forgotten and fall into obscurity.
Huh. Your mind and my mind work very much alike. If you look, I actually address that issue very directly in the introduction to my new book, which just came out last Tuesday. And in fact, that chapter, which you might want to take a look at, was excerpted in maybe yesterday or the day before. If you go to the site Literary Hub, LitHub, they have a crime read section. And a couple of days ago, they excerpted from the introduction of my new book, which addresses that very issue, because I've given a lot of thought to that, why certain crimes become undying parts of our culture mythology and other equally heinous or sometimes much more heinous crimes. They might become media sensations for a short while, but they quickly disappear. And I do have some theories about that. Well, one thing is what I've come to discover as a historian of American crime is that there are certain what I like to think of as signature crimes that come to preoccupy particular eras for different social and cultural reasons, but basically because they seem to crystallize or embody or epitomize certain kinds of widespread anxieties that are afflicting the culture at the moment. So, for example, years ago, I was writing a book about a famous poison murder case that happened in New York City around 1900. And in researching that, I discovered that back then, people were as obsessed with poison murderers as, let's say, we were in the 80s and 90s with serial killers. And the reason for that, I think, is that people really had good reason to be afraid of being poisoned because it was, there was no regulation, no government regulation of food or drugs. There was no FDA. People were, marketing all kinds of toxic things. You can go to the drugstore, buy some cough medication that contained strychnine, and people, parents, mothers were buying milk for their babies from grocery stores, that contained all these toxic substances. They called it swill milk. So, people never knew, if something they put in their mouth was going to kill them. So the poisoner became sort of the nightmare incarnation of that fear. Different times in the 1950s, for example, the juvenile delinquent, was this great boogeyman that haunted the imagination. So there was a famous crime called the Cape Man murder in New York City, again, which seemed to embody that particular terror and became very, very famous. The Charles Manson crimes, Manson's family seemed to be the living the living realization of every middle American's nightmare about sex and drug crazed hippies and so on and so forth. The OJ case, as I know from my own research, is you can find virtually any day somewhere in the United States, a case of a cuckolded husband, rejected husband or boyfriend stalking and murdering his wife or girlfriend. But the OJ case brought so many issues of race and celebrity that were very, very acute at that moment. Anyway, so I think that's one of the reasons that certain crimes take on this status, whereas other crimes, as horrific as they might be, they don't resonate in that way with the public.
So your new book, Maniac, is about a school shooting that happened a while ago.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard of this case. So with this theory, would you say that if the shooting in the book happened today, it would be more frequently talked about because there's this very current fear of mass killings and school shootings and things like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Exactly. In the book, I describe it as a horror ahead of its time. Because when it happened, It was the deadliest school massacre in U.S. history. It was the worst case of domestic terrorism before Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City. But again, it wasn't as horrific as it wasn't the kind of crime in a way that meant anything to people. Now, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and perhaps you've noticed, is that our obsession with serial killers has kind of faded. They still appear all the time in movies and TV shows, but it doesn't dominate people's, nightmares the way it did back in the 80s and 90s. And it's been supplanted, by a fear of mass murderers, which got going with the Columbine killings. I think 9/11 had a lot to do with that. So now, instead of the serial sex murderer, instead of, like a woman's fears that they're going to go to a bar and pick up the wrong guy, it's going to be Ted Bundy or something, that's really faded. Now the fear is you're going to be someplace and some human time bomb, is going to detonate. So yes, the Bath School Massacre, it did make national headlines for a while. A couple of days later, it was sort of supplanted from the front pages because Charles Lindbergh made his transatlantic flight, which was a momentous event at the time. But beyond that, again, it wasn't the kind of crime that spoke, to the dominant anxieties of the age. Whereas, God forbid, if something like that happened today, as you say, it would be, 24/7 news coverage.
Speaking of the 90s, I initially wanted to talk, to have this interview with you because I really wanted to discuss, I guess you could call them serial killer groupies, for lack of a better term. I was inspired by a TikTok that I saw. It was a fan edit, which was made by someone who is my age, a teenage girl. And it was a fan edit of Eric Menendez, who murdered his parents in the 90s. And granted, the Menendez brothers' trial was a little more layered and controversial than a blatant, crazed murderer. But it was still so dystopian to see this young girl today swooning over a convicted murderer who's still in prison and was probably in prison since she was born. And I've seen this in much more extreme cases, people, mostly women, being romantically involved with horrific murderers and serial killers.
The whole phenomenon of women, being very attracted, to psychopathic killers. I mean, that's been going on forever. Virtually every case that I've researched going back to the 19th century, the mid-19th century, there have always been, we now call groupies, who have attended the trials of some of these really horrific killers. I mean, there are these horrible serial killers, some of whom, are so repulsive, they can never, probably get a date in real life. As soon as they're convicted of these, hideous crimes, they just become inundated with love letters. And, Charles Manson got married to a 20-year-old girl or something when he was in his 80s or something,
Yeah, it's bizarre. And, even in a broader scope, it seems that the majority demographic of true crime fanatics are women. So why do you think that this extreme form of fan behavior happens with women and these horrendous killers?
Well, I think it plays to two things. This kind of, it's an extreme pathological exaggeration of this kind of bad boy thing. If you look at movies, romance movies, the woman traditionally, there's always some nice, boring guy she's involved with, and then some bad boy comes along on his motorcycle. So this is an extreme form of that. And I think it's also, there's a little Beauty and the Beast fantasy going on. It's like, my love will domesticate this monster.
Yeah, I've seen young people today, romanticizing Richard Ramirez. Yeah. And I'm like, have you forgotten what he's done? This guy's awful.
I was once on a TV show. I don't know if you know who Henry Lee Lucas was. I mean, he was, first of all, he made Richard Ramirez look like Brad Pitt. I mean, he was so physically repulsive, and he committed these horrible crimes. But again, I was on a show I was actually on a couple of TV shows back then with a woman who was in love with him and so on and so forth. So, yeah, they all, I mean, I think Ramirez got married in prison. I have a funny anecdote. Do you know Edmund Kemper? I knew somebody once who was a girlfriend of a guy who was in jail, and he was in prison. He was in prison with Edmund Kemper, and this woman was visiting her boyfriend once, who was not a murderer. Well, actually, he was a murderer, but anyway, but he wasn't a serial killer. But anyway, Kemper had this girlfriend, and this woman that I knew, said to this woman, "How can you have anything to do with this guy? He was like capitating women and doing this to them, doing that to them." And this woman said, "Oh, he's so over that."
That's so funny. My favorite is the Jeffrey Dahmer fan club.
Yeah.
Because not only is he terribly disturbed, but he's also not interested in women at all.
Right.
Anyways, so I've often heard the argument, especially today in this sort of golden age of true crime that we're in right now, that this fascination with these morbid crime cases is in part perpetuated or encouraged by, violent movies and video games that are popular today. And I understand you have a book about this argument. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I wrote a book called Savage Pastimes, which grew out of a New York Times magazine piece I did years ago. The premise of the book is that twofold. One, it demonstrates that contemporary pop culture is not only arguably less violent than the popular culture of the past, but also, it illustrates that every time a new form of popular entertainment is created, it provokes the same reaction, which is all these self-appointed moral watchdogs, start attacking it as something that's going to corrupt the morals of the youth. And this goes back, years ago, I wrote a book about a 13-year-old serial killer named Jesse Pomeroy back in the 1860s. He was known as the Boston Boy Fiend, and he was a classic psychopathic sex killer who fortunately was, unfortunately, he murdered and mutilated two even younger children, but at least he was caught at that point and couldn't continue his homicidal career. But anyway, as soon as he was caught, people started claiming that he had been provoked to commit the act because he had read too many violent dime novels. Dime novels back then, were these cheap, they were a little bit precursors of the pulp novels of the 30s. And they were very violent. I mean, they're incredibly violent. But it turned out Pomeroy had never even read one. I mean, this argument has been going, and, when radio was invented, there were the same arguments. And when movies were invented, there were the same arguments. Back in my day, there was a whole crusade. There was actually a Senate committee set up to investigate the comic book industry, because there was a very famous book called Seduction of the Innocent by a famous New York psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham that claimed that comic books were turning kids into juvenile delinquents, and at that time what was considered, an equally horrific thing, homosexuals. It was rock and roll. So, yeah, I mean, nowadays it's going to be video games. And of course, what happens is, then people get older and, they look back at all this stuff in their youth as very benign. I'm absolutely sure the day will come, when people are going to be looking back and thinking about, how come kids aren't playing innocent games like Grand Theft Auto anymore? Everybody's going to be plugged into a virtual reality helmet, and they're going to be actually feeling the blood, from the zombies splatter on their face. I mean, there's no question about that.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a lot of movie posters on my wall, and I have one of Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, and I have a Shining poster with Jack Torrance in the ending scene. And my mom always jokes around. She's like, "Why would you want to look at that all the time? It's going to corrupt your mind."
Well, just reading a quote from Alfred Hitchcock, after he made Psycho, people were claiming the same thing. Psycho was going to turn everybody into, this crazed transvestite killer. And the interviewer said, mentioned some guy who had murdered 3 women. And the last woman he murdered, he killed after seeing Psycho. And Hitchcock said, well, what movies did he see before he killed the first 2 women, So, that's always been going on. The other thing about this issue is you never can tell what's going to set off a psycho. Charles Manson ordered, the Tate killings after listening to the Beatles' White Album, which is one of the most benign pieces of popular art ever created. And there have been any number of homicidal maniacs who've gone on to killing sprees after, like Albert Fish, because he'd been reading the Bible.
Right. And even in something that's meant to inspire goodwill can inspire something horrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I watched an HBO series, The Jinx, which is about the crimes of Robert Durst. And I thought it was really unique as a piece of true crime content because it was entirely based on Robert Durst. And it almost made you sympathize with him and his cause. And, the episodes focused on his childhood, and you almost felt like he was this misunderstood guy. And I see a lot of true crime now tends to focus on the humanity in some pretty gnarly killers. Do you think that's dangerous?
Well, all true crime focuses more on the perpetrator. I mean, again, people want to read about the killer and his killings, as regrettable as that might seem. So, yeah, that's always been the case. And think about the Jinx and also then the podcast Serial, I guess. I mean, I think they were turning points in the sense that, what's happened is very fascinating to me. I mean, when I first started writing true crime, which was many years ago, it was still considered a totally sort of subcultural genre. I mean, I could convince my publisher to publish my first book in hardcover. They were still seeing, true crime as, this kind of thing that was sold in, bus station paperback book racks. And this was even after In Cold Blood. But, but it's gained now such cultural legitimacy. And I do think the Jinx and Serial had something to do with that.
That is just so cool that you were deep into true crime way before it was hip.
Yeah, we knew. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking with me, Dr. Schechter. I learned so much. You've been listening to the QC Pod, podcast about all things Queen's College. The QC Pod is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more, visit queenspodcastlab.org/QC Pod. Our show music is Lake Monsters by They May Be Giant. The episode was produced by Eden Ayala. Our head producer is Elizabeth Moreno. Our show heads are Jason Tagaw and Joseph Cohen. I'm Eden Ayala. Thanks for listening.